Hello, 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 everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. That means that I am here to answer your questions about J.R.R. Tolkien and his legendarium, whether it's The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, or any of his other works, or even questions about the man himself. I'm here to answer your questions, even if I have to do a ton of research to give you the answer. Quick channel update. We do have a lot to get to. We have 18 questions to get through today. So quick channel update. We have crested 1,400 subscribers. That's absolutely amazing. Kind of snuck up on me. I was just thinking like, hey, we just hit 1,300 as of last episode, and I just looked at it now, and it was at 1,401. So that's fantastic. It's probably a higher number by the time the video comes out. Even by the time I'm editing, it might be higher. So that's absolutely fantastic. If you have been watching my videos and you haven't subscribed already, please do so. We're trying to move on up in the world of YouTube, of course. But like I said, I don't have a lot of time to speak on things. We're going to get to our reading, and we're going to get to our questions, because we have 18 questions to get through today. So here we go. I'm going to read a bit of The Children of Húrin, actually my favorite Tolkien novel. And we're going to read from the chapter called The Journey of Morwen and Nienor. So we get a little bit of a Glaurung in here. But Glaurung lay there, just within the shadow of the great passage that led inward from the ruined doors. And he had long been aware of the spies, though few other eyes in Middle-earth would have discerned them. But the glance of his fell eyes was keener than that of the eagles, and outreached the far side of the elves. And indeed, he knew only that some remained behind and sat upon the bare top of Amon Ethir. Thus, even as Mablung crept among the rocks, seeking whether he could ford the wild river upon the fallen stones of the bridge, suddenly Glaurung came forth with a great blast of fire, and crawled down into the stream. Then straightway there was a vast hissing, and huge vapors arose, and Mablung and his followers that lurked near were engulfed in a blinding steam and foul stench. And the most fled as best they could guess towards the Sifil. But as Glaurung was passing over Narog, Mablung drew aside and lay under a rock, and remained, for it seemed to him that he had an errand yet to do. He knew now, indeed, that Glaurung abode in Nargothrond, but he was bidden also to learn the truth concerning Húrin's son, if he might, in the stoutness of his heart, therefore, be purposed to cross the river as soon as Glaurung was gone, and search the halls of Felagund. For he thought that all had been done that could be for the keeping of Morwen and Nienor. The coming of Glaurung would be marked, and even now the riders should be speeding towards Doriath. Glaurung therefore passed Mablung by, a vast shape in the mist, and he went swiftly, for he was a mighty worm and yet lithe. Then Mablung behind him forded Narog in great peril, but the watchers upon Amon Ethir beheld the issuing of the dragon and were dismayed. At once they bade Morwen and Nienor mount without debate, and prepared to flee eastward, as they were bidden. But even as they came down from the hill into the plain, an ill wind blew the great vapors upon them, bringing a stench that no horses would endure. Then, blinded by the fog, and in mad terror of the dragon reek, the horses soon became ungovernable, and went wildly this way and that, and the guards were dispersed, and were dashed against trees to great hurt, or sought vainly for one another. The neighing of the horses and the cries of the riders came to the ears of Glaurung, and he was well pleased. One of the elf riders, striving with his horse in the fog, saw suddenly the Lady Morwen passing near, a grey wraith upon a mad steed, but she vanished in the mist, crying Nienor, and they saw her no more. But when the blind terror came upon the riders, Nienor's horse, running wild, stumbled, and she was thrown. Falling softly into grass, she was unhurt. But when she got to her feet, she was alone, lost in the mist without horse or companion. Her heart did not fail her, and she took thought. And it seemed to her vain to go towards this cry or that, for cries were all about her, but growing ever fainter. Better it seemed to her, in such case, to seek again for the hill. Thither undoubtless Mablung would come before he went away, if only to be sure that none of his company had remained there. Therefore, walking at a guess, she found the hill, which was indeed close at hand, and the rising of the ground before her feet, and slowly she climbed the path that led up from the east. And as she climbed, so the fog grew thinner, until she came at last unto the sunlight on the bare summit. Then she stepped forward and looked westward, and there, right before her, was the great head of Glaurung, who had even then crept up from the other side, and before she was away her eyes had looked in the fell spirit of the eyes, and they were terrible, being filled with the fell spirit of Morgoth his master. Strong was the will and heart of Nienor, And she strove against Glaurung, but he put forth his power against her. "What seek you here?" he said. And constrained to answer, she said, "I do but seek one Turin that dwelt here a while, but he is dead, maybe." "I know not," said Glaurung. "He was left here to defend the women and weaklings, but when I came, he deserted them and fled. A boaster, but a craven, it seems. Why seek you such a one?" "You lie," said Nienor. "The children of Húrin, at least, are not craven. We fear you not." Then Glaurung laughed, for so was Húrin's daughter revealed to his malice. "Then you are fools, both you and your brother," said he. "And your boast shall be made in vain, for I am Glaurung." Then he drew her eyes into his, and her will swooned, and it seemed to her that the sun sickened, and all became dim about her, and slowly a great darkness drew down on her, and in that darkness there was emptiness. She knew nothing, and heard nothing, and remembered nothing. From there it goes to pick up what Mablung is up to, and it's a little while before... Well, it's not that long, but we find out that, she basically loses her mind. The dragon's curse upon Nienor is so powerful, and he's there on a mission specifically to torment the children of Húrin, because this is Morgoth's will. Morgoth wants to punish Húrin, and using his family to do so. And he doesn't simply want to kill them. He wants to ruin their lives. And that's what this book is really about. So, Turin, a lot of the bad things that happen to Turin I find to be his own making. But Morgoth certainly is not helping things, and his agent Glaurung, the father of all dragons, is certainly not helping things either. And when he shows the visions of the bad things that are happening to Turin, he is showing Húrin sort of a curated bits of it. He's not seeing his son's entire life. He's seeing only the bad parts, and he's not seeing the ways in which Turin caused these things to happen of his own, I would say, a measure of ignorance and a measure of pride and a measure of impatience, I would say. But then again, then we have his sister Nienor, who here is cursed, and she loses her mind. She forgets who she is, and she becomes almost feral, and she strips off of her clothes, and she runs through the woods. And she's actually found by her brother, but she doesn't know who he is because her memory is gone at this point. She cannot remember who he is, his name, his face, anything about him. And he doesn't know that this is his sister because the last time he actually saw his sister, she was a little girl. And he has a vision of her in his head as a little girl, and he doesn't really realize that she's grown up. He knows on an academic level that it's been several years and that she has, of course, grown up, but he sees her in his mind as an older version of her child self, when actually she's changed in her looks quite a bit. So he winds up marrying her, which is really disturbing, of course, and he even gets her pregnant. And of course, it's a great tragedy, and they do find out towards the end. And well, you guys probably know how the story ends. And if you don't know how the story ends, I highly recommend you go and you get the book, The Children of Húrin. It is definitely Tolkien's darkest tale, and I think his best novel. A little better than The Lord of the Rings. I think The Lord of the Rings is fantastic, of course. But The Children of Húrin, it's a much quicker read, and it's a much darker read. And I always say that it's the novel that George R.R. Martin would have written if he was a better writer. Anyway, let's get to your questions, and we're going to start right here with question number 1. Our first question comes in from, and I am sure I am not going to pronounce this right, but I think it's Shonailan. I hope I'm saying it right. It's Eastern European sort of name, so I'm not very good at pronouncing those. I hope if you're watching this and I got it wrong, please leave a comment and tell me how to pronounce your name, and I will endeavor to get it right in the future. Why did the Balrog emerge in Moria if he was hiding? Because he was found, is what it basically comes down to. The Balrog that later became known as Durin's Bane was a refugee from the War of Wrath, and it tunneled away from Beleriand, where the War of Wrath took place, to the east, under the Misty Mountains, far below the dwarven city of Khazad-dûm. These tunnels were made both by Morgoth's minions and also by the nameless things that gnaw at the root of the earth. And they were often used by evil creatures to travel, especially creatures that did not like sunlight or did not want to be seen, like the Balrog. The Balrog slumbered, but the dwarven city that was above it grew over time, both outward and downward, as the mines of Moria became deeper. Eventually, they pierced the Balrog's chamber. It was due to this fact that it had been discovered that it went on the offensive. It did not wish to be discovered by anyone that represented the Valar, so it wiped out everyone, with very few dwarves managing to escape. The only dwarf that actually saw the Balrog and survived was Dane the Second Ironfoot, who did not know that it was a Balrog. He simply knew that there was something terrible down there, and he called it Durin's Bane. Okay, next question. Our next question comes in from Michael Hudson, who asks, what was Saruman's reaction when, against all his expectations, Sauron and the One Ring were suddenly destroyed? Well, Sauron was not destroyed. Let's get that out of the way. He was made weak, and he was actually made so weak that he could never again trouble the world. Saruman, as far as we don't know what his reaction was because the story doesn't really follow him at any point. Sauron's loss was actually a good thing for Saruman, though. He was in far more danger from the Dark Lord than he was from realms such as Gondor, for example. Gandalf had offered him clemency in exchange for surrendering the keys to Orthanc and his staff, but the wizard declined. So Gandalf banished him from the Order of Wizards, and he locked him up within Orthanc. However, Saruman was able to talk Treebeard into letting him out, and he escaped north to the Shire, and he took it over in secret. Gandalf's offer, however, was that if Saruman agreed to the terms of surrendering the key and the staff, he would be free to go as he pleased. He wouldn't be under Gandalf's, he wouldn't be under like a custodial sort of thing. He would be free to go where he wanted, even to Mordor. And Gandalf said that, if he so wished, that he could go to Mordor. Though, of course, Gandalf also stated that would be very foolish. Sauron was under no delusions that Saruman was on his side. He knew that the wizard was plotting against him. But he wanted to use him to tie up Rohan in a war so that they could not come to the aid of Gondor. Not only was Saruman a liar, he was a failure as well, because he lost to Rohan. He would find no safety in Mordor or from the forces of Sauron. So it is likely that Saruman had a reaction to Sauron's downfall, and his reaction was probably relief, as this made him the biggest bully in Middle-earth, and he did not need to worry about Sauron hunting him. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in from Simon Cook, who asks, how did Thingol and Melian's story end? So I like this question. This is a good question, because the ending of their story, at least provided in the Silmarillion, is, of course, not the end. We're not even told what becomes of Melian in the Silmarillion. We know that Thingol dies. He's slain by the dwarves in the Battle of the Thousand Caves. From thence, we know that a host of Ents, led by Beren, revenges the king, and Beren reclaims the Nauglamir, which is the necklace containing a Silmaril that the dwarves had taken. Luthien wears the Silmaril until her death, upon which her son Dior takes it, and eventually he passes it to his son Earendil, who bears it to the Undying Lands, using it to pierce the veil of the Valar. But what happens to Melian? Thingol, of course, was an immortal elf, and being a Sinda, did not make his fate any different from other elves. He would have gone to Mandos, where he would likely spend some time atoning for his arrogance before getting a new body and being reincarnated. Melian just passes out of the tale. However, according to the book The Nature of Middle-earth, we learn that she also passed into the West. As one of the Ainur, she was under no such ban on returning. Tolkien never mentioned if the couple resumed their marriage, but knowing Tolkien's personality and Tolkien's philosophy, I would say that it is extremely safe to assume that Thingol and Melian are still very much a couple living in the West until the end of the world. Okay, next question. Our next question comes in from Tyler Stivers, who asks, how was the ban of the Valar enforceable if the Ainur were not allowed to harm the children of Ilúvatar? Would they have made elves carry out the executions of mannish trespassers? So, interesting question. They certainly were not executing anyone. The ban was essentially enforced by the veil of mist and confusion around the Undying Lands in the First Age and a stern lecture in the Second Age. The veil was pierced by Eärendil and Elwing, using a Silmaril as a guidelight. Eärendil met them as they gawped around Tirion upon Tuna and brought them to Manwë. So Namo, who was also known as Mandos, made the argument that they were not allowed to be there, but Manwë stated that their doom was his decision, and they could stay. But as mortal half-elves, they must make a decision to be elves and immortal, or to be men and mortal. Elwing immediately chose immortality, and though Eärendil would have preferred to be mortal, he did not wish to ever be sundered from his wife, so he chose immortality as well. The only condition was that they could never return to Middle-earth, though Eärendil did return under special exception during the War of Wrath, and he was in the sky the whole time. So, once the veil was lifted, it was the honor system. And those men of Númenor who did go to Aemon were never seen again. We know that Pharazôn and his fleet were killed in the Akallabeth. Some tales say they were buried underground in some sort of stasis. I don't personally buy that because it's related to the Dagor Dagorath. But this was not the Valar doing this. This was Ilúvatar himself. But what of Amandil, for example, who sailed to the west to warn Manwë? He was just never seen again. Mortals who broke this taboo would not be executed, because execution would be pointless. All that would do is put their souls into Mandos until their allotted time was up. All mortals have a certain amount of time in the world before they depart. Dwarves are a slight exception, because they don't have an afterlife. At least not yet. We're talking about men and hobbits, though. And if they are killed, or they just die before their time is up, they wait in Mandos, which is also called the Halls of Awaiting, and then they travel a path that is known only to Namo and to a location that is known only to Ilúvatar. Mortals like Amandil would simply be put in Mandos to wait. They cannot leave once they're there without the blessing of Namo, so they would just wait out their life in solitude, and then they would depart. All an execution would do would be the same thing, but it would put their blood on the hands of the Valar, or elves, if that was the case, and they would never ask the elves to kill for them, because that's another form of kinslaying, and they're very much against that. The Valar are against killing in general, so no, they wouldn't kill anyone. They would just basically give them a life sentence in solitary. They would be stuck in Mandos until their time is up, and then they would die. They would depart from the world naturally. Okay, next question. So Richard Seymour here is the next question. He's asking specifically about me. You seem to be very deliberate in your pronunciation of Tolkien's language, words, and names. Are there terms you need to guess at? Would Professor Tolkien cringe at anything he might hear on YouTube Tolkien channels, yours or others? Well, I would hope that he wouldn't. I really would hope that he wouldn't. I've always been interested in linguistics, though. I'm hardly on the level of someone like Tolkien. As a child, I absolutely butchered pronunciations going through the books. I know for a fact that I got names like Celeborn wrong. I would say Celeborn. I did not know what those little accents on letters meant. That is until I got to the back of the book where the appendices were. Both The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion include guides to pronunciation. I try my best to follow these as best I can. He does not tell you outright how to pronounce words, but he gives you examples of how vowels work, how words are structured, the rules, the grammar, that you could figure out each word on your own. One such example is... I'm going to spell out the name of this elf, Feanor's son, Maedhros. It's Mathros. But if there was an accent on that E, it would be different. Like Feanor. It's not Feanor, it's Feanor. And that's what those two little dots mean. Tolkien also wrote a lot of Elvish language articles and A lot of it was compiled in publications such as the Parma Eldalamberon, and I've studied those, of course. Tolkien, though, understood that while his fans may find all this very, very fascinating, they were not always going to get it right. He doesn't strike me, or actually he didn't strike me, as the type of guy to get angry when someone pronounces something wrong. He might, at the most, I would say gently, correct them. One thing that he insists is that in Elvish languages, the letter R is always trilled in all positions. I tried to do my best at this, though I find it difficult in, like, Aragorn. I say Aragorn a lot. Aragorn. It's actually Aragorn. And his name is indeed Sindarin, so it should be Aragorn. But I wind up saying Aragorn a lot. But it would not be applied to, like, Frodo. It's not Frodo. It's Frodo. Because that's Westron. It's not an Elvish dialect. So, you have to, like, try your best to say, okay, that's an Elvish word, it's pronounced this way. That's not an Elvish word, it's not pronounced that way. And when I'm speaking Elvish, I tend to lean into a Quenya accent much more than a Sindarin accent anyway. Sometimes things aren't actually super consistent. Smeagol, for example, is an unusual name. Tolkien has that accent on there, so because there's that little dash over the E in Smeagol, you would think it's Smeagol. But Tolkien himself said Smeagol, and he didn't pronounce the A at all. So in a discussion with my friend Matt Richardson, we were talking about this. Why isn't it Smeagol? Why don't you pronounce the A? And I said, well, it's a Storish name. It has no Elvish origin. So it likely did not follow this pronunciation guide, because the pronunciation guide was just for... what you would say is for elves. It's not for men. It's not for hobbits. So sometimes you have to guess at things. Like the black speech, I try to make it sound Turkish. I did get a comment on YouTube once, right here on YouTube, that asked me something. It was on one of the iceberg videos. How could you call yourself a Tolkien scholar when you pronounce 80% of the words wrong? And I just simply told this person, this fool of a took, that I was following Tolkien's own pronunciation guide, and I didn't get any further reply on that thread. I think sometimes people get it in their head, the correct way to say things, and they think that's the correct way to say things, so they hear it differently and think, well, that's wrong, but there's actually a pronunciation guide. When I'm talking with other Tolkien scholars, I actually sometimes sort of internally cringe when they say things wrong. Like my friend Sid Kemp says Sauron all the time instead of Sauron. And I said it's Sauron to him once, privately, not like on a podcast or anything. He says, I can't roll my R's. And I'm like, okay, you can't roll yours. There's a lot of people who don't have that skill, but it's not Sauron. If you say it without the trilled R, it would be Sauron. Which is perfectly fine, but he says Sauron a lot. Matt says Fingolfin. That's the one that really drives me crazy. I let a lot of it go, but I'm like, Fingolfin is crazy because it's Fingolfin. We had a discussion recently about Legolas. Everybody says Legolas. And I said, and then Matt said Legolas. And I said, Matt, that's actually correct, grammatically speaking, Legolas. It should be Legolas. But Tolkien said Legolas. So even he was not always internally consistent. If you were to follow his strict rules, it would be Legolas. But he said Legolas. That's just the way it was. Anyway, thank you. Let's get on to the next question. And our thumbnail question comes in from Zorua Galaxy, who asks, can elves from Tolkien's books read minds or speak to others using their minds? Yes, they can. There were several books that mention this: Morgoth's Ring, The War of the Jewels, The Nature of Middle-earth, and there was a part in The Lord of the Rings even where they did this. It was Elrond and Galadriel along with Gandalf as they were journeying up through Dunland right before they parted. Morgoth's Ring revealed the existence of a collective of essays written by J.R.R. Tolkien called Quenya and Eldar, which were then published in the subsequent book, The War of the Jewels. One of the sections of Quenya and Eldar speaks about Osanwe, which is a Quenya Elvish word that means exchange of thought, the Elvish practice of communicating telepathically. The book, The Nature of Middle-earth, also reveals that every being in Tolkien's world that has a soul can use the Osanwa. But the existence And I actually am saying it wrong. See, we just talked about pronunciations, but it's Osanwa, not Osanwa, because there's an accent over the O that gives an exception to the way that Elvish is usually said. So Osanwa. But the existence of a body dampens this deeply spiritual ability. So most powerful it would be in the Ainur. They're spirits, and they only wear bodies as clothing to be seen by the children of Iluvatar. They're not real bodies. However, in incarnate forms, such as the wizards, their ability to communicate telepathically is lessened. It is further lessened in the elves, and much, much more lessened in men. That's why you almost never see mortals communicating telepathically. It is possible, though. Elves can do it better than men, but as they are incarnates, you really only see it in the greatest elves, such as Galadriel, whose power is undoubtedly boosted by her ring, Nenya. And it's interesting that in the scene in The Lord of the Rings, where it's Galadriel and Elrond and Gandalf, they are the three ring bearers, although their rings have actually lost their power at this time. But they're also very close together. And Gandalf the White is incredibly powerful, Elrond's powerful, Galadriel's powerful, but even without the rings. Okay, next question. So the Oski Boski asks, was the One Ring the cause of losing fair form by Myron? No. Myron is, of course, Sauron. That's his real name, is Myron. His inability to appear beautiful was actually a bit of divine retribution. Sauron, who was originally Myron, had a habit of making himself appear in fair form to curry favor with elves and with men. Most famously, he did it as Anatar in Eregion. He tricked the elves into forging the Rings of Power. He also put on fair guise at the end of the fair stage to gain a pardon from Eonwa, though that didn't turn out so well. In Numenor, he did the most damage, though. They were already somewhat a fallen people, but he got them to worship Melkor. And then they worshipped him as Melkor, and they burned men in the temple as sacrifices to him. Ostensibly to Melkor, but it was really to Sauron. And finally, they attempted to attack the Valar. The Akalabeth was a devastating event. It was devastating to Sauron, although as he fell into the pit, he laughed, knowing that he would, of course, survive. He traveled back to Mordor in spirit form, and he was quite dismayed to find that not all of his enemy, the Dunedain, had perished in the Akalabeth. And to make matters worse, they weren't his followers. They were the faithful that he had hoped to wipe out. So whether his inability to take a fair form was due to how destructive the event was, or it was God specifically singling him out for retribution, is unclear. But either way, it was the Akalabeth, the event, that caused him to lose this ability, not the One Ring. Okay, next question. Could Sauron detect the presence of Nenya and Narya in Dol Guldur? If he did, would he try to get Narya from Gandalf like he took Thrain's ring? No, he did not have that ability, as doing that would require the One Ring, actually. Part of the magic of the One Ring is One Ring to find them, which allows Sauron to see all the bearers of the Rings of Power. While he is separated from the ruling ring, though he is in rapport with it, he does not lose any of the native power that he poured into it, but he does lack the ability to do the things that the ring is specifically made for: ruling them, finding them, binding them. Sauron knew which dwarves had the rings because he was the one that gave them the rings. So if those dwarves were still around, they had them, and if not, their sons likely did. However, the three, Narya, Nenya, Vilya, were unknown to him. He knew they were in Eregion at one point because he detected them when he used his ring for the first time. But after that, the elves took off their rings. Celebrimbor hid them outside of Eregion. He gave one to Galadriel, and he gave two to Gil-galad. Out of the three, only one has not changed hands since then. That's the one that Galadriel had. And Sauron would not know exactly which rings had the ring, which elves had the rings, I should say. And he would not know that they were not, one of them was not even held by an elf anymore. Gandalf had one of the rings. So he had no way of knowing that the rings were there. He couldn't detect them because he didn't have his ring. Okay, next question. Did anyone else, beside the original 9 ring wraiths, ever possess the 9 rings before them, or were they always their owners from the beginning? No, they were actually originally worn by elves. Aside from the One Ring, all of the rings of power were made by the elves, for the elves. They were under the tutelage of Sauron, who was in disguise as an envoy of the Valar that called himself Anatar. After Sauron created the One Ring, the elves forsook their rings, and Celebrimbor, as I mentioned in the previous one, he took 3 that he had created himself out of Eregion. Sauron took the rings back when he attacked Eregion, and he started handing out the rings to dwarves and men. He didn't know about the 3, but he got 16 of them back. So during the Lord of the Rings, the Nazgûl actually don't even have their rings anymore, because at some point, we don't know exactly when, but at some point Sauron demanded that they surrender their rings back to him. And so he actually held those 9, as well as 4 that he recovered from the dwarves. So 12 of the rings are in Sauron's hands. But yes, elves, we don't know which elves, just like we don't know which men. One of them was named Kamul, but we don't know which elves had the 9 rings before that. Okay, next question. So here's a quick one. At the final showdown with Sauron at the end of the War of the Last Alliance, only Gil-galad, Círdan, and Elrond among the elves are named to be present, but where was Glorfindel? Shouldn't he have been there, or was he? So his mission was specifically to assist Elrond and Gil-galad, which leaves us with 2 possibilities. The first possibility is that Glorfindel was there, but was not mentioned in the histories. This particular history was spoken of by Elrond in The Lord of the Rings, and written about by Elrond in the Silmarillion. So if Glorfindel was in fact there, Elrond of course would have known this, and if he was left out of the chronicle, it was on purpose. The second possibility is that while Gil-galad and Elrond and Círdan went off to war, somebody had to keep the homestead safe, and that somebody may have been Glorfindel. So there's that as well. Somebody in the comments mentioned that there could be a third reason, that he was there, but he wasn't fighting Sauron, that he was off fighting all the orcs and trolls and such. And I can't say that that's true, because Sauron's army was already defeated, and he was under a very long siege. For example, like Anarion was not killed in battle. He was killed because somebody in the Dark Tower threw something out of a window and it hit him on the head. And another person mentions that maybe he had not arrived yet in Middle-earth, but Tolkien stated that he definitely arrived in the Second Age, because he was there specifically to assist Elrond and Gil-galad. Gil-galad wasn't alive in the Third Age, so his mission could not have been to help Gil-galad if he arrived in the Third Age. So he arrived along with the Blue Wizards in the Second Age. Okay, next question. Here's one that comes in from Justin Glassband, who asks, what if all the provinces of Gondor had rallied more quickly before Mordor's attack at Minas Tirith? They had plenty of time to rally. Gondor actually wasn't the issue here. Gondor had plenty of time to get everyone together, and they did in time. The issue wasn't a lack of time to get Gondor's troops mustered, but the fact that they just didn't have enough troops. When Gandalf and Pippin arrived in Gondor, the Hobbit noticed several smoking fires in the mountains, and Gandalf explained that these were the beacons of Gondor, to call all the provinces to send troops to Minas Tirith to defend Gondor. Over the next several days, Pippin watched as the city was emptied out of civilians, and many troops arrived from different parts of Gondor, most notably a group of soldiers from Dol Amroth that was led by Prince Imrahil. However, this was not enough, as Gondor had been in decline due to constant wars and depopulation, and there were plagues. So the saving grace was not more Gondorian soldiers, but the Rohirrim. Saruman tried to prevent Rohan from aiding Gondor, but he failed. Rohan may have arrived sooner, though they did ride out with great haste as soon as the official request, the Red Arrow, arrived at Meduseld. Okay, next question. Here's another one from Justin Glassman, who asks, how would it have gone if, instead of sending Faramir's doomed riders, Gondor launched a full-scale, swift, organized, preemptive strike into Osgiliath before Sauron's forces were fully ready to attack? It would have gone badly. There's a good reason that Osgiliath was taken and Minas Tirith was not. Minas Tirith was a fortress. It was originally Minas Anor, the Tower of the Sun. Closer to Mordor was Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon. Minas Ithil was taken due to the watchfulness of Gondor slipping, and they pressed forward to Osgiliath, eventually destroying the capital. All of Gondor's forces pulled back to Minas Tirith, which had great fortifications, both natural and man-made, and it was not open to Mordor like Minas Ithil had been. With the Tower of Minas Ithil now occupied by the enemy, it was now called Minas Morgul. Osgiliath was really a sitting duck. Taking the city back would hold no strategic advantage for Gondor. The best they could have done is to slow Mordor's army, because Osgiliath is a choke point at the river, but the Corsairs were coming up the river. It would not go well without a fortified position. Even in the Fourth Age, while Osgiliath was restored, it did not become the capital. Minas Tirith remained the most important city in Gondor, with Aragorn II Elisar choosing to let it remain as the capital rather than restoring that title to Osgiliath. Okay, next question. Here's one from Nick Smith, who asks, when in the Lord of the Rings books is it explained that the elves are immortal? So the immortality of elves is touched upon at several points in the story. First off, we have the ring verse, which is not part of the main text, but it's written at the start of the book. It mentions mortal men doomed to die in opposition of the elves. When Frodo is traveling with Aragorn, he tells him of the tale of Beren and Luthien, and specifically calls Luthien immortal in this verse of his song. As Beren looked into her eyes within the shadows of her hair, the trembling starlight of the skies, he saw there mirrored, shimmering, Tinuvil, the elven fair, immortal maiden elven wise, about him cast her shadowy hair, and her arms like silver glimmering. Elrond speaks of events that he was present for thousands of years ago. Galadriel speaks of events she witnessed long ago as well. The presence of Glorfindel, who died in the fall of Gondolin, is the biggest indicator that elves not only don't perish naturally, they return from unnatural death. And it is true that Tolkien originally did not intend for the Glorfindel in The Lord of the Rings to be the same character as the Glorfindel from the Fall of Gondolin, but he later decided that they were the same guy, and that's where he came up with the idea of the elves reincarnating. In Lothlorien, Frodo sings a song about Gandalf to Sam, where he specifically mentions the elves as being immortal as well. And then in the appendix, it's mentioned that the men of Númenor were long-lived, but they were jealous of the immortality of the elves. So there are likely other examples, but there's just a few to sate you, I hope. Okay, next question. Here's a fun one. What was the issue with the Sackville-Bagginses in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings? The Sackville-Bagginses were, to put it simply, jerks. Lobelia redeemed herself, however. So as Bilbo was a confirmed bachelor with no children, there was the open question of who his wealth and his estate would go to after he died. Bilbo was rich even before he left on his adventure. His father was a rich man, and his mother was even richer. Bag End was the biggest and nicest hobbit dwelling in the region. It was built by his father and financed by his mother. Throw a bunch of dragon gold and half of a troll hoard, remembering that the dwarves never claimed the troll hoard. It was a split between Bilbo and Gandalf, to top it all off, and he was likely the richest hobbit to ever live. This is not even accounting for the mithril coat, which usually hung in a museum in the capital of the Shire, which was worth, according to Gandalf, more than all of the Shire and everything in it. Otho Sackville-Baggins was Bilbo's eldest cousin, and it was assumed that he would inherit Bag End along with his wife Lobelia. There was animosity between them, however, when Bilbo was declared legally dead after disappearing for a full year, and most of his estate was sold off, which he had to buy some of it back, actually. Lobelia was rather fond of Bilbo's spoons. and she stole several of them. In The Lord of the Rings, Bilbo starts off as 111 years old, or as he calls it, 111 years old, and he doesn't look a day over 50. Meanwhile, Otho has died of old age, and Lobelia is old, and she's still waiting for Bilbo to die so that she could have Bag End. When he announces Frodo as his heir, she's quite offended. She says that Frodo's not even a real Baggins, he's mostly Brandybuck, which Merry finds very amusing. And this is actually rather hypocritical of her because she herself was only a Baggins by marriage. She did get her wish because Frodo sold her Bag End, but it came at an unintended price because Saruman made it his home, imprisoned her, and had her son Lotho murdered. She was 100 years old when she was rescued, and she died just 2 years later. And she was devastated by the loss of her son and the desolation of Saruman. She gave Bag End back to Frodo, and in fact made him her heir, as when she died, he used her money to help out the displaced hobbits who lost their homes. After this, the house fell out of the Baggins family because Frodo sailed to the west. There were no more Bagginses in the Shire, and Sam Gamgee became the master of Bag End. Okay, next question. Here's a question that came in from Meldon Tarnayan, who asks, David Day is often said to portray his own speculations on Tolkien's work as canonical. Could you quote from his books this allegedly biased content? I don't like to speak negatively about other Tolkien scholars. I really don't. I find that it leads to bickering and infighting that we really shouldn't have in our community. But David Day, man, he is a piece of work. If you buy his books, this is what I'll say. If you buy his books, buy him for the illustrations because the illustrations are absolutely fantastic, and just ignore the text. Other writers, Hammond, Scull, Foster, they've written much, much better books on Tolkien. There is no doubt that a lot of what Day says is speculation and at times straight up fan fiction. Now, I want to say one thing very clearly. There is nothing wrong with speculation or fan fiction if it is presented as such. Oftentimes, when I am asked questions and there are not canonical answers to pull from, I will have to wade into the realm of surmise and give my speculation, and I always try to make it as clear as I can that I am speculating. I'll use language. I'll say, well, knowing what we know, we may strongly guess that such and such and such, or it is likely that such and such and such. Tolkien's work is unfinished. We must speculate at certain things, and he is in fact the type of guy who intended his fans to speculate. And that was supposed to be part of the way that fans consumed his work. The issue with David Day's books is that he doesn't let you know when he's speculating or outright writing fan fiction. He often makes common factual errors. I'll give you one example. I don't have his books because I don't want to, but I will give you a few examples. He stated that the First Age began with the rising of the sun. That's not true. While it is true that the First Age calendar started there, the Years of the Trees, which was the previous calendar, that's part of the First Age. In one of his books, he made a very simple error. It's a very funny one. He said that Celebrimbor was Elrond's wife. No. I can understand mixing up the name Celebrimbor with Celebrian, but I can't understand not having an editor. I mean, I guess an editor wouldn't know that that's wrong, right? It would just be another elf name, but having a fellow Tolkien scholar look over his work to make sure that these sort of errors are not made. He presents his maps as accurate, but his maps often contradict Tolkien's maps. He's also banned from the Tolkien Society, if you could believe. He's the only person to ever be completely blacklisted by the Tolkien Society. He's not allowed to go to any of their gatherings, and it actually doesn't have anything to do with his books. It's because he kept showing up to events without paying for his registration. Some of his books have also been repackaged under other names, so it'll look like a new David Day book is out, but it's actually an old David Day book with just a different title, and you could buy it thinking it's something new and have the same exact book that you already have. So there's some of the issues that I would say that I have with David Day and his work. Like I said, I don't have his books, so I can't sit there and read from them and give you the exact quotes, but I think you have more than enough to go on there. Okay, next question. Here's another one from the Usky Busky who asks, could Sauron erupt Mount Doom with the One Ring powers? He could do it without the ring. He doesn't need the ring for that. Though having the One Ring in his possession increases Sauron's powers on Earth. This is specific to his power to dominate the wills of others. It is also true that not having the ring does not weaken him. His powers are diminished in that he does not get access to the ring's specific power of domination, to find the rings, to bind the rings, and all that. But he still has all of his natural power, and erupting Mount Doom seems to be one of those powers. Mount Doom was created by Morgoth a long time ago, and it remained dormant until Sauron came to Mordor. Sauron chose Mordor specifically because Mount Doom was there, and he used the Cracks of Doom, Samath Naur, as in his greatest forgeries. The mountain only erupts by Sauron's will, and it was said to go completely dormant after the destruction of the One Ring. Now, it did erupt when the One Ring was destroyed, and somebody asked, well, how could that happen? And I said that the mechanism of Sauron making the mountain erupt would be putting his will into the mountain, and Gollum is dropping the greater part of his power into the mountain. So mountains might be sentient and even sapient in Tolkien's universe, according to Gimli at least, but I wouldn't accuse a volcano of being intelligent, so having Sauron's power dropped into it may have come across as an instruction to erupt, or it simply just overloaded the mountain and it erupted. But that would be the last gasp, the dying breath of the mountain, so to speak. So his power broke at that point when the One Ring was destroyed, so it couldn't erupt again. So we could see that he does not need the ring to erupt the volcano because he didn't have the ring for the entirety of the Third Age. Sam noticed as they were climbing up the mountain that the path had been washed away by lava several times and then rebuilt. He saw the signs of that. So this indicates that Sauron's minions would go out and repair the road after every eruption, and since it looked like it was done recently, we could definitely say that he does not need the ring. As a matter of fact, the foul blackness that blanketed Gondor and allowed his troops to move during the daylight was probably from the mountain. Okay, next question. This one came in from Zorro Galaxy, who asks, were there any Vanyar elves that lived in the kingdoms of Doriath or Gondolin during the First Age? No, not really, no. Terms like Vanyar, Noldor, Teleri, Sindar, Sylvan, Avari, they're not different species of elves. They're not even racial characteristics. They were cultural divides. As they tended to marry their likes, they did develop certain traits that were unique to them. But generally speaking, the type of elf that someone was considered to be was based wholly on their culture. That being said, out of the 4 types of elves that embarked on the initial journey to Aemon, defined mostly by who they followed, though the Sindar were essentially Teleri that did not get to Aemon, the Vanyar were the ones that went to Aemon and got there first, and it was stated that all of the Vanyar completed the journey, placing the amount of Vanyar in Middle-earth at 0. So, and like I said, if any of them didn't make it for whatever, they were just not considered Vanyar. When the elves, or at least some of the elves, came back to Middle-earth, they were almost entirely Noldor. The one Vanya that was mentioned to make this journey was Elunwa, who was Turgon's wife. But she perished on the Helcarax, and she never actually made it to Middle-earth. Turgon's daughter Idril was raised in Gondolin by her father. Her mother was obviously not present. She was sent back to Aemon the hard way. This would make Idril a Noldo, because she was not raised with any Vanyar culture. She also married a mortal, Tur, though he later became immortal and was counted amongst the elves. And her son, Earendil, was a mortal Perethel, which means half-elf, though he later was made immortal, as was his son Elrond, but they do not fall into the categories of Noldor or Vanyar. Okay, and now we get to our final question. Did Tolkien write any more about the history of Rohirrim other than in The Lord of the Rings? Yeah, he sure did. The story Cirion and Eorl and the friendship of Gondor and Rohan gives us the tale of the founding of the land that later became known as Rohan, and the oath of Cirion, steward of Gondor, and Eorl the Young, the first king of Rohan. This is found in the book Unfinished Tales. The synopsis that I would give you would be that the Rohirrim were originally a tribe of Northmen known as the Eotheod, who were allies of Gondor. Gondor's population had diminished, so the steward, after the Northmen had helped them in yet another war, invited them to stay, ceding the region of Gondor, known as Calanarthan, to them. Cirion brought Eorl to Elendil's grave, and they swore a sacred oath, making Calanarthan its own sovereign country with Eorl as the king, and they locked the two nations into an eternal alliance. The new nation was called Riddermark in the language of the Eotheod, who started calling themselves the Horse Lords in their language, the Rohirrim. In Gondor Sindarin, the land was called Rohan. Okay, so that's actually all the questions I have for you today. I had a lot of fun answering your questions this week. If you've gotten to the end of the video and you're not subscribed, please subscribe. I know you guys, if you're enjoying the videos, you should definitely subscribe. Help me get those numbers up. And if you want to support me further, consider membership. Membership is very cheap. It only costs $5 a month. You get some emotes. You get a cool little Gandalf G rune on your profile picture whenever you post on here. And also, the biggest thing, the only one that really matters, you get to see all the videos early. And I don't mean a few days early. I mean at least a week early. All of these episodes of this particular podcast, you will get to see a full week ahead of time. And many other videos you will get to see sometimes 2 or 3 weeks early. So that's really cool, especially when you're looking for stream VODs like the Council of Tolkien or my readings of The Hobbit, which we actually finished The Hobbit, but we're going to be moving on to the Fellowship of the Ring for the next stream. So, like I said, membership really, really helps me out in a very major way. So consider that as well. But if you don't want to join, you certainly don't have to. You can just continue to enjoy the videos as you are. I will see you guys next week.